Welcome to DMV Spotlight on ESPN 630, the sports capital, where we shine a light on local stories from the D.C., Maryland, and Virginia area to inform, enlighten, and inspire you. I'm Barbara Britt. I'm delighted to welcome my guest today, Dawn Dalton. She's the Deputy Director of the D.C. Coalition Against Domestic Violence. You've probably heard by now that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So first of all, I just want to thank you for joining me today on DMV Spotlight.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Barbara.
So Dawn, as you and I were just chatting before this interview began, I'm really, I don't know how else to say this. I'm shocked that we're still talking about this. This is 2019, and I remember when domestic violence sort of became a thing that was reported and talked about. It wasn't shamed and kept behind the closet, and we understood that, you know, it happened to women of all walks of life and not necessarily any socioeconomic group. And yet here we are, decades and decades and decades later, and we're still battling this battle. Help me.
Yeah. So you're right. Decades ago, like in the 70s and 80s, there was a big, and early 90s, a criminal justice push. So like, let's hold perpetrators of domestic violence accountable. And there was a whole law enforcement response and prosecutorial response. That doesn't mean the stigma and shame went away. And I feel like, you know, in response to your comment, that's still what we're struggling with. The fact is, when we think about domestic violence, and just to sort of get some pieces out there on the front end, certainly there are male victims of domestic violence. There are female victims of domestic violence. It happens in heterosexual relationships. It happens in homosexual relationships. We have a lot of information about heterosexual relationships where the male is the perpetrator and the victim is the female. And that in that dynamic, that is the predominant gender dynamic that's going on there. And so when you think about women who have shame attached to being abused, one of the pieces that is often central in the dynamic of an abusive relationship is often the person who is being abused. The shame, the responsibility for that harm being done is placed on them, and it is internalized. And so there's just so much isolation that goes to support that shame.
I was going to ask you that because that, just from the very little that I know, just from over the years and what I've read and spoken to people, is that one of the first things that happen in a relationship, and it can be one of the signals in a relationship, is that the perpetrator begins to isolate the partner from their normal support system. Let's put it that way. Their family, their friends, the things they love to do, the places they love to go, those are doors that begin to get cut off. So that there isn't necessarily the connection there that's always been there, and therefore there isn't necessarily an easy way to get out.
And isolation takes place in different ways. So there's what you're talking about in terms of someone feeling like they can no longer have time with their friends or time with their family or their regular support system. And that definitely happens in abusive relationships. We've also seen dynamics where the person who's the perpetrator is the most wonderful person outside of the dynamic between the folks in that relationship. And so no one would ever think or believe that they could be abusive.
That gives me creepers. It just gives me creepers because it just, I mean, is it, and maybe I'm asking you questions you can't answer. Is it a psychological disorder? Is it a control thing? Is it a violence thing? Is it all of the above?
So there's a few things at play here, right? So in thinking about control and power, there's power and control in every relationship, whether it's a platonic, whether it's a work relationship, whether it's an intimate partner relationship. It's when there is an abuse of power and control, and how is that being negotiated? And when it turns into harm, then we're in a whole different playing field. And, you know, there's a lot of theories around why that happens. Why does someone choose to abuse? Which I wish is the question many people ask, as opposed to why didn't she leave? But when you think about why does someone choose to abuse, there is that feeling to have control, whether that is from a patriarchal perspective of like that's men should have more control, or they feel threatened in some capacity by a woman. There's lots of reasons that come into play here. But it's, as you pointed out at the beginning, an issue we've been dealing dealing with for centuries.
And is it a cycle? Is it something that has, and again, this is not excusing. We're just trying to figure out behaviors here. Were they part of some kind of abusive situation that was their norm, that they saw that was, that's how we roll?
In certain situations, absolutely. It is, we are all a product of our environment. And so if you grew up in a violent environment, whether that's in a community setting or in your home setting, that's what you learn, and how you learn to deal with emotions, positive, negative, and otherwise.
So how, and you touched on this, how do you remove some of these barriers? I mean, help people understand how difficult it is to extricate yourself from that relationship when, and you well know this, sometimes that isolation is financial as well.
Yes.
And the things that you love, involving children, involving pets, involving the things going to work and being able to support yourself. How does that all happen, and how does the person who's being abused get themselves free?
So I want to answer that question, but I also want to preface it by also talking about how someone who chooses to use violence in their intimate partner relationship, how they can choose differently as well, right? So
fantastic.
Yeah, it's not, we're all capable of change. And I think that in relationships where there is violence, it didn't start that way. If it started that way, no one would stick around. Right? Like if it was the first date and there was violence, no one would want to maintain that. It was positive. It was building trust. It was becoming vulnerable. It was all of those things. And oftentimes when there is an abusive relationship, there is, from the abusive person's perspective, feelings of remorse, not wanting to do it again, feelings of sorrow. But for whatever reason, they're going back to their feeling for need of control over a situation or feel threatened in some way. It's cyclical in terms of the repetitive nature of that abusive dynamic in the relationship. And so what I want to say is, if you recognize behaviors within yourself or in other people that are close to you that are abusive, there are other options.
So is there help for somebody who does that? Somebody who says, wow, for whatever reason, I haven't realized that that's me and that's what I'm doing, or that I could be that person. What kind of help is there?
Yeah, so there is counseling out in the community that is available for people who are choosing to use violence in their relationships across the DMV, in the district, in Virginia, in Maryland. And I think that we really need to be mindful about how we're getting that information out as well. And I think a lot of times, victims need resources. Don't get me wrong. I work against the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and this has been my career's work. But we also need to be thoughtful about how we're ensuring that folks who are using violence are getting the assistance they need to stop using it.
So the obvious question for me, when you have that situation, the person who has been using violence, they may be thinking to themselves, I don't like putting myself in that spot. If I go out and ask for help, and I admit that I've been using violence, I'm going to get arrested.
So if they're getting help from a social service organization or they're seeing a mental health clinician, there's confidentiality that is wrapped up all in that. And so you're able to work through the challenges that you're faced with by when you choose to use violence, and that won't lead to law enforcement engagement.
Okay, so we've talked about those barriers. I do want to circle back and talk about removing some of the barriers that in this case those who've been abused are facing, and how some of those barriers are being addressed. And certainly that's one of the main things that the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence is so good at doing.
So one of the things that is just so critical when you think about a response to somebody who is being abused is they know their situation best. So when they're telling you, what they need, listen to them and try and get them the resources that they need, whether that's housing, whether that's counseling, whether that's an attorney. Let's talk through options and figure out what is a good path forward. There's no cookie cutter response. every dynamic and every relationship is going to be a little bit different. People's comfort level. Some people do not want to reach out to law enforcement because, for the fact of the matter, we know that in D.C., Black and brown people are over-criminalized, and there's mass incarceration of Black and brown people. And so if you are being abused by someone that falls in that racial category, you may be reluctant to turn to the law enforcement for a response. If that's the case, then let's think about what other resources might be available to you. So at the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, we are a membership organization of all the domestic violence service providers throughout the district. So shelter, housing, legal services, counseling, and we work to connect survivors to those organizations that can work directly with them.
And there is a very vulnerable time period for a victim, a woman usually, when she's reaching out for help. Mm-hmm. Or even, and you and I both know that a protective order is nothing more than a piece of paper, mm-hmm. as much as you need to get it, mm-hmm. because there has to be a legal paper trail, and that's all part of the process. But it's no protection in your own home or even in certain areas. So talk about the housing element. I know that is one of the what do you call your coalition pieces within the coalition? Is there a specific organization that does provide that shelter for people?
So there are 4 domestic violence housing organizations in D.C. They are an organization called D.C. Safe, and they provide crisis shelter. My Sister's Place provides emergency housing as well as longer-term housing. DASH, which stands for the District Alliance for Safe Housing, and provides both emergency and longer-term housing, as well as House of Ruth, which is another longer-term housing provider here in the district.
And all of those are truly safe places for people. And when they go, can they bring children? Can they bring pets? Can they bring, are they open at 2 a.m? Mm-hmm. And can they get in, and can they get their case worker or whatever? What is the process?
Yeah. So DC Safe is our crisis housing response in the district. And so if it's 2 a.m. and somebody has fled, that is an option for them. They're the first go-to. And they have a strong relationship with the Metropolitan Police Department as well. So if they're involved and they are responding to the scene, they can link that way as well. So that is, and it is shorter term housing. It's like emergency crisis housing. And so then there's staff that's there to work with them to figure out, like, okay, what's next? Who do we connect with, since it's a shorter term placement? But then in terms of, you mentioned pets, because a lot, and I've done domestic violence work for over 20 years. And earlier in my career, I worked in a shelter setting. And there were people who stayed in abusive relationships because they knew that their pets would be harmed by the abuser, because that is a vulnerability, right? So if an abuser is choosing to go after what will somehow hurt or harm the victim, and there's a pet there that is very close to that person's heart, that's just another way in which they can cause harm. So to that end, we are seeing across the country more pet shelter, animal shelter organizations partnering with domestic violence organizations. We have yet to have a housing organization here in the district have pets on site, but there is that connection with animal shelters and that sort of thing.
So you could conceivably take your pet to a shelter, mm-hmm. and then get yourself to where you can be, where you are safe.
Right. So you're safe and your pet is safe.
And for children, mm-hmm. if you are fleeing a dangerous situation, you have your children with you, is there a specific shelter that you recommend?
No, they're all open for families as well as individuals. And regardless of the age of the children, regardless of the gender of the children, it's an available resource regardless of the family makeup.
When people are in these scenarios, there's often other issues that accompany. There's not necessarily always one issue. Are the resources on site able to deal with all of the issues that this person who's already in a crisis situation may be facing?
Not necessarily, but that's why we serve a purpose as the coalition because we bring those service providers together so that those kinds of collaborations and networking can occur, so that if somebody needs representation in court, that, okay, let's link you to, one of the legal service providers, domestic violence, or DC Volunteer Lawyers Project, like let's get that connection made. Similarly, like addressing credit issues, right? So where are those other organizations that can address the issues that the survivors are having? So it's very much a collaborative and connected safety net here in the district as we respond to the needs of survivors.
Okay, so let's take apart. We talked a little bit about where people can go in crisis, and then you mentioned some longer term options. Mm-hmm. I know we've actually spoken with the District Alliance for Safe Housing here in the past in different format. And is that more long-term housing for people who are trying to get away from these situations?
It's up to 2 years. And it's also counseling and case management and an array of other services are available to folks that are staying in that housing. So, they are the ones leading the show in terms of, and what I mean by that is the survivors identifying what they need assistance with, and then the organization works to supplement their case management and getting resources to them.
I'm speaking today on DMV Spotlight with Dawn Dalton. She is the Deputy Director for the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and of course October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Let's talk about some of these other outreach things that the coalition does. There is an organization called Ujima.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us about them and what is their unique role in this particular issue?
So Ujima is the National Center on Violence Against Black Women, and it is a program that is actually being incubated at the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And so they are a resource here locally, but also for communities across the country that are looking to address specifically the needs of Black and African American women who are experiencing intimate partner violence. And what that means is, like, what does the service delivery look that really keeps in mind the cultural aspects that are important to folks that are identifying with that community? And we talk about that a lot at the coalition in terms of what is a culturally specific response, and that taking into consideration the different nuances that folks that aren't white mainstream survivors may need. So we have a large Ethiopian community here in the district. There's Asian Pacific Islander. Like, what are those culturally specific responses? And so for the Black community, Ujima really serves as a national resource, but is currently housed in the coalition.
And may I ask, are we all agreeing that domestic violence is wrong?
I certainly am.
Okay, so that I just want to make sure that we're all agreeing on that.
Yeah, the culturally specific response is wedded and embedded that domestic violence is not acceptable in any kind of
any culture.
No,
not in this country.
No,
thank you.
And I'll say to you, I've had folks from different cultural backgrounds ask me. There are different cultural norms, right, where men are more take more of the lead and women are more submissive. And my response to that is whenever there's a dynamic that somebody starts feeling like it's no longer okay, that's when we've crossed a line. And so that's defined differently for every individual, regardless of what culture you come from. But when someone is saying internally or even externally to a support person, I don't like what is going on, I don't like what this person is doing to me any longer, then we've crossed a line.
And you mentioned this earlier, is that it becomes, there is always, as you said, there's power and control and interesting dynamics within relationships, but when it becomes abusive, mm-hmm. because it can also include verbal, emotional, mm-hmm. and again, we talked about the isolation, the financial. It's not always black and blue and broken bones, right. God forbid, but it encompasses those elements as well, and they are also detrimental.
Correct.
And are a signal. Is there? I noticed that you also have a DC Coalition for Girls that you work with. Is this helping to sort of train up our younger generations and say, this is okay, this is not okay? And certainly you have, your own decisions that you get to make at certain times of your life. for what you want, but we're all saying that violence and this abuse of power in a relationship is not okay.
Right.
Is that the heart of what this is?
Yeah. So the DC Girls Coalition started at the Coalition Against Domestic Violence a few years ago, and it was really looking at what was going on for young women in the district and what their experiences were with dating violence and their experience in schools, and really working to hear from them about what their challenges were, what help they may need and assistance they may need in sort of school system response, which has been really important for our work, policy work at the coalition. We just saw the DC Council pass and the mayor sign a piece of legislation at the end of 2018 called the School Safety Act. And it is really a leading piece of legislation across the country in that it requires every school, K through 12, in the district, private and public and charter, any school, to have a policy that addresses how school is responding to domestic and dating violence when it's brought forward by its students, providing education to school personnel, teachers, counselors, to know how to respond, and giving classroom instruction to students around what healthy relationships are, what unhealthy relationships are, and how to navigate the whole range of emotions that they're learning how to.
It's difficult enough.
With. Yes.
So,
yes.
So that's so important. And you mentioned the public policy efforts and the training and the outreach. Do you do the public policy in the district alone, or do you do it on the national level as well, or does it just depend on the issue?
So we are focused primarily on the district. Every state and territory in the country has a federally recognized coalition against domestic violence, and we serve that role here in the district. And so our main focus is on local legislation and systems advocacy. Certainly because we are situated in the capital of the United States, we do dip our toe in a bit in some federal advocacy, but it's mostly geared locally.
And I have to ask you, because, where we live and where we work, and we're not always aware of boundary lines per se between D.C., Virginia, Maryland. If somebody's calling you, they're in Virginia, do you have partnership with folks in Virginia and Maryland, PG, Montgomery, Fairfax, Prince William, say, we can't necessarily help you, but hang on one second and I'll get you somebody who can.
Yeah. Those connections are just critical. Like as I was referencing, just in the district, but because to your point of where we are, we have to have that as well.
So, and before we leave that, I do want to give these numbers. We'll give them again in just a few minutes at the end of the show. But if you're listening today and you either are a perpetrator, or maybe you recognize this in yourself, or maybe you're in a situation you need to get out. You're looking at your kids, you're looking at your pet, you're looking at yourself in the mirror, you got to get out. You can call 844-4HELP-DC for the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. When they call, what happens, Dawn, when they call that number?
So it's actually not housed at the coalition, but it's the DC Victim Hotline, and they are their own entity, but they are there 24/7 and are able to, take in what the needs are, get resources to the person who's calling, to try and get them the help and assistance that they need.
And does it also apply in a crisis situation? Is it best to call 911 in a crisis situation?
If you are being harmed and want police response, call 911.
Okay, fantastic. And that number, we'll give it again at the end of the show, is 844-4HELP-DC. There was a section on your website, as I mentioned to you, that was very interesting to me, and it's called Take Action. And one of the things that we see in our society with people who identify as a victim and have been a victim, that at some time you want to regain control of your own life, and you realize that something's been taken from you, or that you want to be proactive. And that's why I really liked this take action concept. And so tell us about some of the things that people can do when they look on the website and they say, you know what, this isn't okay, and I want to do something. So they can take action. I noticed one of the things is they can host a cell phone drive. Tell us about that.
So cell phone drive is something that we do at the coalition. We all are getting new phones all the time, right? Like recycling.
Especially if you're a
through.
teenager.
Yes. And even our big corporate partners that are here in the district, right? Like buying for employees and the such. So we collect old cell phones that get repurposed and sent back out to assist survivors if they don't have that resource and that is available to them. So it is that information is on our website, which is dccadv.org, about how you can donate cell phones to us.
You could easily do that at your workplace. You could just set things up and have people bring it to school, wherever. Your holiday gift drive. We do have the holidays coming
right
up
around
on
the
us.
corner.
Yeah,
That's right.
so tell us about that.
So we do a gift drive for all of our housing member programs every November through December, where we're collecting unwrapped gifts for kids, as well as like gift cards and those kinds of things that can be gifts for adults that are staying in housing. And so that everyone has a sense of holiday while they are in this very tumultuous time of their lives.
That is a fantastic idea. How has the response been? Have people been creative over the years in how they do that?
So we've gotten, yes. So there are different churches, different corporate offices, different organizations that really, when you get somebody who just is dedicated to this idea and really takes ownership of it, we've been blessed by the generosity of the people in the district.
That's fantastic. And then also because it is October Domestic Violence Awareness Month, you have some special events happening this month throughout the district. There's the Spread Love Trivia Night. I think that needs some explanation. I need to know what that is. That's October 16th at the Exiles Bar at 6 p.m. Tell us about that.
So Spread Love DC is the campaign that the coalition has to really... Oftentimes, as we've talked about, domestic violence conjures up concepts and images of bruises, broken arms, certainly the worst part of abusive relationships. And the thing that we also want, while keeping that reality present, what we also want people to think about is, what do healthy relationships look like? What's the alternative, and how do we move towards that? And so what we decided when we launched the Spread Love campaign is we really want to raise that up as a way to start talking about domestic violence, because oftentimes folks kind of turn off. It's not something that folks want to engage in conversation so easily. So the Spread Love DC campaign, and we do a trivia night. This is our second year in doing it during October. And it's just a fun time where people get to come together. There's a lot of trivia buffs out there. And if we could do it under the concept of Spread Love, that's what it's all about.
That's so fun. And then the other one I wanted to highlight was Purple Thursday Fest. That's October 24th at National City Christian Church. What is that?
So Purple Thursday was started by the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence about 10 years ago, and has since gone to be a national day of action. And this year we're excited that we will be holding a festival on the steps of the National City Christian Church. We're excited to partner with them. We have some initial confirmation that the mayor will be joining us at that event. It's an opportunity for organizations to do some tabling. We'll have some performances, some spoken word. And we're excited about it.
That'll be fun. Do you ever like to have volunteers come and help you, or is it difficult in this scenario? Or I'm sure there's a process that people need to go through.
Volunteers are always the name of the game. So we can never do anything that we do without the help and assistance of some good-hearted folks out there. So in terms of just particularly for that event, helping and coordinating and making sure people are in the places that they need to be, if folks are interested in volunteering, you can definitely call our office and we will put you to work.
Fantastic. And I want to give the website address again for the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. It's dccadv.org. So it's the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, dccadv.org. If you want to get more information on any of these programs, as well as some of the take action items that you can participate in. And the DC Victim Hotline, please, one more time, is 844-4HELP-DC, 844-4HELP-DC. And that is a number that you can call if you're in crisis right now, or if you know someone who is and they need help. And I just want to thank you today for joining me today on DMV Spotlight.
It has been a joy. Thank you so much for working to raise the profile on this issue.
Well, I hope that this is our last conversation. I don't know that it will be, but if that would be fantastic if it was. But yes, there's obviously more work that needs to be done. I've been speaking today with Dawn Dalton. She's the Deputy Director for the D.C. Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Thank you so much for listening to DMV Spotlight on ESPN 630, the Sports Capital. I'm Barbara Britt.